Just to set the scene a little bit for this discussion, we've got 5 genuine experts from very, very different ranges of expertise here, and 1 amateur, and that's me. I'm going to just give you my impression of this report, which will set, I think, frame some of the discussion I hope we're going to have. Being a journalist, I only read this last night in a hurry, and was expecting this to be just another dull report, but I was actually really, really struck by what, if I could put it slightly luridly, I saw as a combination of sort of Malthusian vision, with the world's population growing to 8-9 billion, 60% extra food demand by mid-century, and a Dantean depiction of the impact of climate change on this, with 2% reduction in annual food growth every year. And these 2 facts really did quite alarm me. It's not often that I read big think tank reports and sit up that bolt upright. So we've got very, very expert people on this panel, but I have a very, very big journalistic sort of frame for approaching this topic of managing risk in the age of climate change and weather volatility. Let me start with Patrick O'Toole, who's head of the Family Farm Alliance. And I think, for me, more interestingly, a big rancher, a cattle and sheep rancher, am I right in saying?
Yes, sir. On
the Wyoming-Colorado border. And even more interestingly, it's your wife's family's ranch, is that correct? And
yes,
she's
sir.
had it since 1883. So you've got some institutional memory there about the impact of changing climate locally on how it is to be a farmer. And I'd love, first of all, to hear from you, since we're here in the United States, and since you're a rancher in the west of it, what have you seen in terms of climate change and its impact on farming?
Oh, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you all. You know, it's interesting, especially when you put it in the context of multiple generations. My grandchildren are the 6th generation on our ranch, and our responsibility is to keep them doing it. And what we've seen is volatility. 3 years ago, we had the wettest year in our history, 350% of normal snowpack. Our ranch is up on above the river, and we never thought flooding would be an issue, and we had to replace all of our French drains because everything flooded. The next year was the driest year in the 130 years that we've been there. And so managing for volatility is really something that we're thinking about a lot. And part of our reputation, not just in our family, but our watershed, is problem solvers. I'm very fortunate. I call it standing on the shoulders of giants, and in my wife's family, they had very little feet, but they were giants. And, you know, this sort of intergenerational look at the resource. And what we are so fortunate to have is a conservation district, which is very dynamic with great leadership and a vision of where we're going to go. And so you look at what does it mean immediately to me? It's usually about water. It's about storms. 2 weeks ago, we finished shearing just as the rain came. We were really happy about that, and unfortunately it turned to snow and killed about 150 lambs that night. And so part of the way that we're looking at our business is how do we manage the risk, the volatility that we're seeing with you know, dry years, wet years, intense storms. For example, we're building a new lambing shed, and even though we're on green grass when we lamb, we want to have a little bit more ability to control that. But we're also working sort of on a macro sense. We're right at the headwaters of the Colorado River, so the Continental Divide is 25 miles above our ranch, and we in our district have decided that we're going to look at a lot of the more challenging issues of the Endangered Species Act and climate in a very progressive way. So we began, about 12 years ago, working with Fish and Wildlife Service and Trout Unlimited and a lot of different partners, USDA, to integrate our irrigation and our fishery. And it was sort of an experiment that turned into be a community-wide effort to look at a long-term, how do you preserve upper Colorado endangered fish. And what's interesting is to watch the dynamics of a community. You know, and in some of the earlier talks today, there was this why, you know, what do farmers think about climate? And at least in the West, people are very distrustful of government. There's just no arguing that. And And so if you were to present, a question as to, how are you going to have the government tell you what to do in terms of X, Y, or Z, they're going to probably not do that. But if it's presented in a case of let's try to make our entire systems more vibrant and look at the holistic way of dealing with our watershed, people really bought in after they established trust. And so, I've been very fortunate to watch people with vision, plan for the future, plan for volatility. But the realities of at least our lives is that in the Western livestock business, let me just say, if you're a Midwestern crop person, there are crop insurances and other safety nets. There really isn't for the Western livestock industry, and it may emerge out of this farm bill that there becomes some. And so you're very cognizant that losses are permanent. When the fellow talked about the corn laying down in the warm and the rain, and it came back up, well, the lambs didn't do that. I mean, once they were gone, they were gone. And I think, part of what we've got to understand, if we're going to, in fact, have a more volatile climate, which I believe that we're in the middle of already, we've got to have safety nets, because if the bottom line is, and I'll just kind of divert a little bit. I was listening to NPR the other day, and there was a debate about India moving from a lot of small farms to more of an American system potentially. And one of the comments was, in America, didn't you know there's more prisoners than farmers? And I'm not commenting on the penal system, but I'm telling you that the concern of losing farmers is huge. And I think we've got to move it into that context.
Now, we're doing sort of opening remarks with my opening questions, but just before we move on to Shenggen Fan, the volatility you're experiencing, you mentioned you lost 150 lambs. You have no doubt that climate change is playing a role and that volatility is increasing because of climate change. And is this confirmation bias, or is this actually a genuinely held view by farmers across the West?
I think if you put it in the context of climate change at the coffee shop, they wouldn't like to have that discussion. But I think what people believe and really understand, not just in my community, but West-wide, is that storage, for example, is crucial. We've got to understand that you're going to have faster runoffs. This year, we're probably 3 to 4 weeks ahead. And so if you're going to be 3 to 4 weeks ahead, you've got to store water to have the ability to have it later. And people buy into that, absolutely.
Thank you. Shenggen Fan, you're the head of the International Food Policy Research Group here in Washington, D.C. You were previously at the World Economic Forum in charge of precisely those kinds of issues there. So you have a bird's eye view of what impact, if any, yet climate change is having on international food security and national food securities. Could you talk a little bit about what exactly you're seeing and the degree to which climate change can be attributed for the kinds of food price volatility we've been seeing in the last few years?
Well, good afternoon. Well, let's recall what happened in 2007, 2008 food price crisis. The food prices increased by 50%, 100% within 6 months to 1 year. Why? Well, there are many reasons. Investment in agriculture, particularly in agricultural research, the competition between biofuel and food, many other reasons. But it is extreme weather events, drought in some of, actually in Australia, that triggered the global food price crisis. And I'm afraid as climate change will become a reality, the food prices will continue to rise very high and it become more volatile. IPRI has a model. I think some of the results in the report actually use some of the model we have been doing at IPRI, shows that from now to 2050, many food prices will continue to rise to a very high level. For example, wheat will be by more than 100%. So we'll see double the wheat prices. Maize will be increased by more than 50%. Rice, almost 40%. So we're not afraid of higher prices. What we are afraid is volatility. So today is high, tomorrow is low. We know that after the food crisis, many people suffered. Hundreds of millions of people suffered from hunger, malnutrition, particularly women and children. And we know that for children, if they suffer from malnutrition, the cost is forever. Cost is permanent. It's like a death penalty. So you ask what we should do at the national level. I think we have to go beyond just the national level. Global level, national level, community level, even household level. At a global level, we have to continue to work to make sure that trade will remain open, fair, and transparent. We know that after 2007, 2008 food crisis, many countries begin to impose certain restrictions on trade. And that actually exacerbated the price volatility, so we needed to avoid doing that. At the national level, investment in agricultural research, not just to increase the yield, but also to build the tolerance against heat, drought, flood, I think we have heard a lot, and also to enhance the nutrition. Recently, there was a report to show that the climate change actually will reduce the nutrition contents of many crops. So how can we really use research technologies to enhance crop nutrition through breeding, not necessarily fortification, biofortification, through biofortification. So, and certain stocks at a national level to make sure that if there is a crisis, the country can move the stocks to the poorest region to help the poor to have access to food. I think the community level plays a huge role. This is often ignored by the development community. So the community, the village level in many parts of the world, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, so they work together to make sure that they can deal with certain crises, whether it's a drought, whether it's a flood, or diseases, particularly animal-related diseases. And more importantly, obviously, it's people. How households can build the resilience against the various shocks. So they must be able to access to food through a social protection program. We have heard about the Ethiopia case. So when crisis came, the poor people can access to food, at least in short run, then they will be able to build their assets for long-term growth, particularly production productivity growth. We just had a conference last week. IPRI held a conference in Addis Ababa on the very much related issue, that is building resilience for food and nutrition security. Mm-hmm. So how can we really make sure that the system at the various levels can build a strong resilience against the various shocks, which will become very often and intense. And many African leaders, African community leaders, national leaders, researchers, NGOs came together, so they try to figure out how can we really do business as unusual to tackle the resilience issues after the crisis.
I'll get back to some of the solutions in the second round when we get into more of a conversation, but Darci Vetter is the Undersecretary for Farms and Foreign Agricultural Assistance at the USDA. And I think more interestingly, you're moving to the USTR, back to the USTR, to head at the agricultural negotiating team there, and got back, I think I'm right in saying, last night at 11 p.m.
Yes.
from Singapore, where you've been doing TPP negotiations on trifling matters like Japanese agricultural tariffs. And most importantly, you grew up on a farm in Nebraska.
Yes.
So you've got a fork to farm perspective on all of this.
Yeah.
Only about a quarter of the world's food crosses borders. So food trade isn't as big as other forms of trade. What role can trade and trade policy play in addressing the problems we're talking about?
Sure.
I have Mr. Fan touched on some of that in terms of his reference to the export restrictions that came in 2008.
That's right. And I think, first of all, you're right that 25% of that global food production is traded. But when you think about how many of our farmers in the world are really participate as a subsistence level, and where most of their trade may be local. Thinking about 25% of global ag production going across borders is actually quite a lot, and it's a really growing number, and it's growing both in volume but also in value and in variety. So I think in the past we used to think about ag trade as a big container full of soybeans, a big ship full of soybeans. Now it's meat products, it's dairy, it's processed foods, it's more consumer oriented where a lot of value is being added at home. So the profile and the number of countries participating as both importers and exporters is also changing, and I think that has real implications for food security. I think trade really can be a tool in helping mitigate the impacts of climate change, and can be used in ways that can prevent further damage or could exacerbate climate change itself. In its most obvious form, trade is used to move where there's a supply to where there's a demand. And in the case of food, that often means where we produce a surplus to places where there is food deficit. And we've talked a little bit about volatility. I know this morning we talked about how there's an impact on production itself, how extreme weather events, drought, all of those make it more likely, perhaps, that there are times of lower yield than one might expect. And so the ability to quickly move food across borders to places where there is surplus to deficit becomes continually important. Trade in food is also very important for nutrition. Not every place can grow every kind of crop, and we know it's important to have a variety of foods, fruits, vegetables, staples, in order to have a very healthy and resilient diet, and trade in food helps contribute to that. But I also think that when we tend to think about trade in food, we think about a big barge full of something traveling a really long distance, when in fact a lot of global trade is among neighbors, who sometimes can be only a few miles apart, but the natural distance to the nearest market happens to cross an international border. And if we can facilitate that happening, the production in rural areas reaching their closest urban center, their closest natural market, without barriers of high tariffs, with predictable customs procedures, we can really help address not only food security, but climate change problems. If you take, for example, a country like Mozambique, long and skinny, and you've got, Maputo, its capital, in the south. The natural agricultural areas that might feed that urban center might well be in South Africa or Zimbabwe. And if I'm a farmer up in northern Mozambique, the best place to take my crops is probably to Tanzania. But if there are strict trade barriers along those borders, I might transport goods hundreds of miles in hot weather on bad road conditions to try and feed that urban center. And the amount of post-harvest loss that can be associated with that can be very devastating. And the cost of transporting that food can really eat into the profits of that local producer. So the food security of the farmer themselves is undermined because they don't get the profits from and can't, feed their own families better. But we can't afford the loss of calories by having bad trade policy. That post-harvest loss can be really devastating to food security regionally if we let that happen. So again, lack of reducing high tariffs, making sure customs procedures are reliable and not burdensome are incredibly important. Another key part, however, of good trade policy is good data policy. So if I'm the farmer in northern Mozambique, I want to know what I'm going to get paid if I send my crop to Tanzania. I need an openness and a transparency in that market locally, but also I think we have a real opportunity that many of our farmers trade in global commodity markets. And if we have better and more transparent data about supply and demand, we can help reduce some of the price shocks we saw in 2008 with wheat supplies. I think we did a better job of that in 2012 when we saw a real spike in corn prices. But data got out there quickly to say that while there was shortage in some areas, overall global stocks, in fact, looked pretty good. And so the impact of that spike was shorter and much less because there wasn't truly a global supply problem there. And we already talked about export restrictions. I think putting in place those high barriers can exacerbate the problem, sends the wrong signal to farmers that by depressing prices locally when in fact there's great demand globally and they should be producing more rather than less and responding in that way. And the last thing I would say about trade as a way to really mitigate the effects of climate change is that good trade policy includes the adoption and implementation of good international standards for food safety and for animal and plant health. and that the rules-based trading system really recognizes those standards. They try to get standards adopted across countries that are the same, so that one, if you're a producer and you can meet those science-based standards, you can send your crops many different places and have them be accepted. And if you're a food safety or an animal and plant health professional, that you have an internationally agreed standard that if you can reach that, if you can look at crops at the border coming in, you feel relatively safe that both your consumers and your livestock and your plants are protected, which is, of course, increasingly important as you see climatic variability and you see pests entering new regions they haven't been before, both animal and plant health pests, as well as human diseases and the food safety impact that brings. So I think there are just generally, those are sort of 3 or 4 different places where good, sound trade policy can be really important for mitigating the impacts of climate change.
Well, we'll get back into more detail about trade negotiations and how you can integrate some of the recommendations of this report into that, which I think would be of great interest. James Cameron, you're founder of the Climate Change Fund, which invests in agriculture and technologies related to climate change. You're also on the British Prime Minister's business advisory. I presume you're no relation to David Cameron.
No.
You don't look like.
Neither do I make films.
Yeah, just wanted to check. And you've been involved, of course, you're head of the Overseas Development Institute. So you have a private sector and a public sector perspective on this. Let me ask you, we've had an IPCC report recently. We've had an American National Climate Change report as well. These are very visible, very public, very, very definitive scientific statements about what's going on. What impact have they had on private investment decisions?
Well, they're both, well, they're more than those two, but the scientific evidence and the compendiums that are being prepared, and this is another one, and most welcome, thank you very much, Chicago Council, help explain to investors how the world is. This is the real world. Investors like to use phrases like that. They like sometimes to dismiss what they think are idealistic notions of where money ought to go with an answer, well, in the real world, we have to make decisions to produce financial returns. We have fiduciary responsibilities to our beneficiaries, and therefore, we won't be looking at this unusual alternative investment you've suggested in renewable energy or sustainable agriculture or some such. And the great benefit of these major scientific and analytical studies is they help explain to an investor of any size and type how the world is now and how it is likely to be, in all probability, over an investment period that can resonate with an investor of various types. Now, having said that, we do not have a very effectively functioning financial system for dealing with these issues. We are woefully short-term. We have very little alignment of interest between the interest of a beneficiary receiving a pension over many decades and the interest of a fund manager being rewarded on returns achieved in an incredibly short period of time, with daily calculations of profit and loss and quarterly reporting from large listed companies. Many of the investments that make sense in this world that we are now looking at and forced to confront are illiquid long-term investments. They're real assets. They have very interesting yields. They produce the kind of dividends that pension funds are actually looking for. Mm-hmm. But they tend to lack the capacity internally to make those investments. Very often they don't have experts in infrastructure in Africa. Mm-hmm. They then have to find someone who does. Mm-hmm. There isn't a large community of specialist fund managers to do that work. More now, thank goodness, but not a great deal. And it's very difficult to move people out of established ways of allocating their capital. Fear and threat are not enough. There has to be opportunity, and it has to be relatively more attractive opportunity now. So one of the challenges we've got, and it's a severe one for the institutional investor community in particular, is to substitute what gives them returns today with what will give them returns today and tomorrow that delivers these essential benefits to our society, which means reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It means properly valuing the natural systems upon which we depend for our livelihoods. And some of that is in turn dependent upon good public policy making. So this is why you find institutional investors will join in big enterprises like the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, and some of these investor initiatives. They will use those multi-investor initiatives to call for a price for carbon, for example. Almost, I don't think I've ever come across a serious institutional investor of any size who doesn't think it's a good idea to have a price for carbon, something you don't often hear in national politics. Right? But they also lack reliable prices for water. They also don't really know how to value the stock that's in a watershed. They also have very little to go by to understand what other aspects of a thriving ecosystem might mean for an investment in a real asset, and they have yet to revalue assets that are going to be affected by climate change, whether it's a road or a railway or a cannery or a piece of land that is vulnerable to flooding.
So there's a great deal of demand there, an appetite, but the institutional structures and the time horizons are something to work on. Well, let's get back into that and talk a little bit about specific investments as well you'd recommend. Yep. Juerg Trueb, you're head of energy and commodities at Swiss Re, one of the world's biggest insurance groups. It's always struck me that in the absence of what James just mentioned, which is political will, and the absence of an actual carbon price or cap and trade scheme in a country like the United States, that we might have to fall back on a secondary hope, which is that the cost of insurance and reinsurance in places like Miami will get so high that the private sector actually lobbies government to do something about climate change. What are you seeing as a senior insurer at the cutting edge of climate and energy? What are you seeing in terms of your position in the market?
Well, let's first talk a bit about the emissions and the mitigation of climate, and then go to the adaptation and the volatility. We, as an insurer, we're very much affected by natural catastrophes. We're also affected by the risks that we assume from the agricultural sector or from the energy sector. And therefore, we have obviously an interest to mitigate climate change as much as we can. And therefore, we come in, for example, trying to shape the political decision-making at the conference of the parties. We disseminate information. We do research about things like climate adaptation measures or mitigation measures. We're actually kind of ranking them depending upon their effectiveness. But then our main function, obviously, is to absorb that volatility that we just spoke about and to price it. And maybe, yes, depending upon what we see, because we always take measured risks, it could be that prices become so high that political and societal will actually will help to bring. But are you seeing any of those price
trends yet? I mean, are you seeing catastrophe insurance?
I think the thing is our durations are usually on an annual basis. Mm-hmm. So kind of in the short term, it's difficult to see big changes. But over the long run, certainly we see big changes. And it also depends a bit upon what type of risk you assume. So the natural catastrophe business is obviously something that should occur relatively seldom. And so the probability to see short-term changes at the tail of a distribution is less as opposed to the probability to see changes at the money, so kind of in the middle of a distribution. And therefore, particularly in our energy business, where essentially we de-risk the cash flow volatilities of utilities, gas or power utilities, where we see around the world a lot of change. And we take it into account in our pricing. In a kind of similar situation, we're seeing the agricultural business. There it depends upon how much of the expected yield you can insure. Can you insure something that allows you for a payout after 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations, and so on? So that kind of obviously affects how quickly you see climate change coming in. And then depending upon region, we see kind of changes in the volatility pattern. So, sometimes if you look into time series, you see that maybe 10, 20 years ago, there was a change, a shift in regime in the volatility of the weather.
Let me ask you, but I'm going to throw out a general question in a moment for everybody, but let me ask you and Shenggen Fan a particular question. We've heard a lot about what technology can do for farmers at the local level. They can get real-time price information, they can get weather forecasts with increasingly volatile weather systems, they can adapt their crop patterns or whatever to this kind of, with the help of this kind of technology. The developing country I know best, India, has hundreds of millions of farmers. Some of them are semi-literate or even illiterate, and many of them don't have electricity. How practical, I understand how good the technology is, how practical is it to get, for example, weather derivatives, weather volatility derivatives, into the hands of a cotton farmer in Maharashtra, for example, and have them on the ground, on that kind of scale, adapting their behavior? And I wanted to ask you two, because you're coming at completely different ends to the problem.
Well, we started that business.
Your mic is...
So can you hear me?
Yeah.
So we started that business roughly around 2003, essentially after the Indian government, together with the World Bank, asked what can be done. We developed it with the local partners, and I think with POSIX at that time, a micro insurance organization, and ICICI Lombard, the local direct insurance company. And it's insurance, by the way, not derivatives.
Your mic isn't brilliant. You might have to sort of project a little bit more.
And I think it was helping because it took the farmers around 2 years or more to get the benefit of the existing indemnity-based scheme. Now the fact that we settled on a parametric index allowed to settle much faster, and therefore farmers could really see the benefit of that particular type of insurance. And it's a big success story because now
we're having a serial mic problem with Swiss Ray.
Better now?
It is for me, but I'm quite close to you.
Can you hear me?
There you go, yeah.
So what I wanted to say is that, so around 2003 we started that, essentially to solve a market that was not functional because farmers benefited just around 2 years from after a bad harvest from the payout of the previously existing scheme, and using parametric insurance allowed them to have much earlier the benefit of a payout. That actually then helped them to get access to credit and so on. And it was insurance, not derivative. So that's what I wanted to say. And it's a big success story because from virtually nothing in 2003, that market developed into a market where nowadays roughly around 5 or 6 million people profit from the insurance.
Shenggen.
Yeah, here I think probably we need some sort of institutional innovations here to make sure that the farmers can have access or better understanding about the insurance. The one is, can we bundle the insurance with microfinance, microcredit? So that's one way we can try. The second is community-based insurance. And finally, probably different type of payments. We did some experiments, or IPRI did some experiments in Ethiopia and China through all kinds of different innovations. By doing that, the demand for insurance can double. So the farmers. So we needed to look at some sort of business unusual case or out-of-box institutional innovations that can serve millions of farmers, as you mentioned.
Patrick, I want to bring you into this because you did mention specifically the lack of federal insurance for some of the problems you're facing in the West. Is this something, Could you get specific climate change insurance? Is that something you're arguing for? Is that something that Western farmers and farmers all over the US would benefit from?
My own personal view is it needs to be event specific, and it needs to be based on what happens in a specific instance rather than an insurance, because I think it's very complicated stuff. It's not a crop that's on the ground, but the interpretation of USDA, for example, on how you would deal with that in a crisis basis needs to be pretty apparent, transparent to the producer, so they have some idea what their expectations and what to do. There was a big storm called the Atlas storm. I don't know if you remember that in South Dakota. It was just the first time I've ever heard of a Western storm getting a name. And I think it was a reality check as to just how an event just so devastating isn't just the event itself, but it's the follow-up. What do you do next? I don't think there's a clear picture of what do you do next.
So presumably, and part of your answer is insurers, you'd have to prove it's climate change related, and insurers can always wriggle out of that one. But a federal guarantee for, I don't know, water shortages or extreme weather volatility is something you are after. Again,
go to California, where maybe the worst drought ever, one of the worst droughts ever. And what's interesting about it, it's both a drought and a regulatory drought. Because as you might know, the Endangered Species Act forced hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of acre-feet of water to go into the bay for dubious reasons. And I think, what we have to make, you ask my view is it's going to get worse rather than better. Cattle prices are good because there's only half the producers there were 70 years ago. We're watching this sort of low or long steady attrition that we have to come up with better answers. I'm not an expert on the insurance part of it, but I'm an expert on what it takes to make sure that the banker stays with you.
So this is my general, sorry, Juergen.
So, I think I would totally agree. Presumably it's not the issue to have climate change insurance or such, but actually insure against a certain event that is...
Sorry, I didn't mean any disrespect to insurers.
I just wanted to say, I think you want to insure against a certain event that puts you at risk, you as a client.
Indeed.
And I think that's the
point taken.
Key. And at the end of the day, I think insurance should then help to be a safety net, to allow access to credit. As you said, kind of bundle it maybe with seeds, with microcredit, to really make sure that farmers have a living even after a drought, that they can pay back their credits, that they can feed their families, send the kids to school. I think that's really the benefit.
James?
Could I just add just a minor point of correction for you there, Ed?
You can add as many as you like.
I think it was somewhere around 1990. I did some work with my colleagues then in service of a group of small island states that became the Alliance of Small Island States that we represented for many years in the climate negotiations on insurance. And what triggered that work was a colleague who discovered Swiss Re and Munich Re's data on sea level rise. And for many of these island states, it was impossible to get insurance for infrastructure at the coastal margin, for example, because sea level rise was an uninsurable risk because it was inevitable in 1990. Right? So that was the real life situation of a small developing country faced with the evidence of climate science then, as endorsed not just by the IPCC then, but the reinsurance industry who had the data in 1990.
That's a devastating anecdote. The general question I had is you're all experts. None of you are elected officials. You've got policy approaches or private sector approaches or on-the-ground approaches to how to deal with this. And you know some of the solutions, and you know that there are technical solutions, at least to some of what we're talking about. The politics is a problem, not just here, but everywhere in the world. The Chicago Council report makes a very interesting and I think very salient recommendation that we have a Congress enabling act to make international food security part of US foreign policy and to codify, as Administrator Shah put it, to codify all of the stuff we're talking about. Let me start with you, Darci, but others can jump in, because this isn't just America we're talking about, but let me start with you. What are the practicalities of getting a bill like that through Congress? You've worked on the Hill before. And what would be the benefit of it succeeding?
Gosh, that's a tall order to ask me how to get that bill passed. You know, I think rather than talk about specific legislation, I think it is important to note that there are a lot of places where the groundwork is being laid to talk about food security as also being national security policy. I think you've seen, you know, the Department of Defense talking about climate change as key to influencing global migration and instability. A key part of that, of course, is access to food and food-secure populations, and insecurity driving some of that migration as a result of climate change and other climate variability. So I think in places that people sometimes didn't expect, there's a climate change conversation popping up, or you know, a food security conversation popping up because of the impact it has on demographics, on national security, on the ability of other governments to govern, and you know, the impacts that branch out from there. So I do think the groundwork is being laid to think about food security as not sort of a niche issue or just a feeding hungry people issue, but rather being a foundation of you know, stable governance and good governance and alliances and managing natural resources generally. So I think that is being done. And I think, you know, the ramifications of that, I wasn't able to hear Raja's full presentation today, but, you know, he talks a lot about the difference between responding to emergencies and really building a true food secure situation, and without sort of recognizing the interrelated nature of these different aspects of our foreign and our food policy, you don't get to that place very well, and that's really what we're trying to do. I know at USDA we focus a lot on, and work with USAID on agricultural development, but we focus on the piece of that that's building agricultural markets. So not just the feeding programs themselves, but looking at how we can help those economies have more transparent and better market data, how they can export and market their goods regionally as well as locally, how they can add value. And we find, you know, a key part of the area of agriculture I work in is at advancing U.S. ag trade. But if you can build incomes by having a more resilient ag sector in those other countries, they become our customers. They, you know, we can participate with them in a back and forth trade relationship that really influences, and in a positive way, both of our incomes and our resiliency. And so I think you'll see more policies like that coming out of policy.
Let's ask Shenggen, what kind of impact this bill would have. I won't ask you to prognosticate whether it could pass, but just what kind of impact could a bill like this
I think the political economy of policy making is critical here. I remember when I traveled to India to have a dialogue with the Indian policymakers, let's say the Planning Commission, I said, hey, Shenggen, what you told me, I know all this, you don't need to tell me, but I have political constituents that I needed to have them to support me or support my party. I think here the critical missing point here is the knowledge information that have to be communicated to the general political constituents, let's say whether it's the farmers or consumers. Do they really know certain policy is good for them? Sometimes they don't know. For example, the subsidies, water, fertilizers, electricity subsidies. I think this issue was mentioned this morning. You know, so over subsidization leads to overuse of all these inputs that also needed to more carbon emissions. But why don't we do something? And part of the reason is farmers actually don't know there is a better option for them. That is to reduce the subsidies, use that money either to support them directly through income support, or invest in, let's say, in agriculture research, in improving infrastructure. So the farmers will be able to have more reliable, cheaper access to electricity and water. So do they have this knowledge? If the farmers have that knowledge, then they will push their political system to change a certain policy that will be favorable to them. Mm-hmm. This is actually the research topic by itself.
And just specifically on the bill that the Chicago Council are recommending, you know, you're, as an international food policy expert, I'm interested in, well, in everybody's views, but yours just in particular, how big a difference, Shenggen, could that?
Well, again, I think the knowledge, evidence-based knowledge is very important. For example, this report is a first step. we need to communicate this report, not just to the people in the room, to everybody here in America. So they will know the importance of this issue.
Of talking about this as a national security issue.
Or national security, or it's
because I think that's what people, you know, they have their humanitarian silo in one side of their head, and they have foreign threats in the other. And what's valuable to me about this report is it's the same
add one thing. For example, the American farmers, you know, in fact, they have pretty good heart. When I talk to them, you know, if we have introduced certain policies that may not be good for poor and hungry people in Africa, they're actually quite sympathetic. But sometimes they need that knowledge, information.
Yeah. James, your namesake came into office promising action on climate change, and not much has happened. Since you've got the same name, if not the same blood, and you live in this daily country, give me your angle on the difficulty of the politics of climate change and international food security from a British point of view.
So these things ebb and flow. You know, you have moments when it seems entirely possible to have big breakthroughs in public policy and lawmaking. And by the way, just, you know, it's perhaps in this town in particular quite hard to endorse the value of law. You know, one can be pretty cynical about lawyers, the amount of lawyers in politics, but at base, at heart, law is an ideal. You know, law is a will to perfection. Law is the way of making the best of our intentions. And it matters to come to agreement. It matters to shake hands and agree that this norm will be applied in the institutions that deliver the rule of law. It really matters. It matters in the US. It matters between states. It matters in our trade relations. It matters that our trade laws are enforced in a dispute settlement procedure in Geneva. This all matters. And it matters to investors. It matters to people who organize their other commercial relationships in their private contractual arrangements. And it matters for registering what really counts in a society. And security is a very good word for us to focus on. And in this instance, thanks very much to work of this type, we are able to better understand the relationship between three interrelated securities: food, energy, and water. Now, they all relate to climate change. And climate change, unfortunately, is one of those issues that covers almost every aspect of human existence, which makes it somewhat overwhelming and extremely difficult to manage. But it doesn't get managed unless you zoom in on things that can be done. And you take as many small steps as possible towards a much larger goal of reducing risk. So my sense is that we have the right language when we use security. We are right to dedicate effort to rule-making, to the establishment of an understanding of what matters and written down in law. But equally, the innovation that's required to deal with these complex problems will emerge in all kinds of ways that no government will ever know. They'll happen spontaneously. They'll happen because someone just really has an insight that they develop on their own, unstimulated by public policy. They'll happen because of a commercial relationship, a supply chain relationship, which will incentivize someone to come up with an answer that their customer wants. So we mustn't pretend that there is a public policy-driven solution to everything in this great complex space.
It is part of the solution.
It's a vital part of the solution, and it matters a great deal that we put effort into getting that public policy right. But my sense is that we have, as in many other areas of life, a relationship between creativity and constraint here. When human beings are faced with real constraint, they get creative. They imagine better ways of doing things. Now, that in turn also affects the way we think about law, because many people in the commercial world have become, I think, lazy with the notion that regulation is always an unwelcome constraint that somehow stifles economic activity. Well, it just doesn't. There are all kinds of businesses that feed off regulation, innovate and produce more business in an economy. So when you have these very vital concerns, public goods concerns, it's perfectly proper for governments to give them priority to regulate or to stimulate commercial reaction by choosing policy instruments. And we have one of those instances here, and I wish whoever is making the running with these arguments the very best of luck in this particular Congress.
Now, I presume everybody on the panel expects that the kind of sudden price rises and price volatility we saw in 2008 will continue to happen. Now, you can't say exactly when, but this is likely to keep recurring. And should therefore be, and the political fallout from such price spikes in places like the Middle East, Mexico, wherever, will continue to be a danger, if not a growing danger. How do we integrate this into our international economic language? And I mean, trade in particular, of course, is a key aspect, Darci. You're about to be confirmed as the key agricultural negotiator for the US.
Please tell the Senate.
I will communicate it forthwith. What role could food security measures and international food trade measures play in TPP, for example? And to what extent are your efforts directed already in that way?
You know, I think there are several structures in sort of the in a bilateral trade negotiation, there are sort of two aspects that we look at. There's the market access negotiation, which is how we and our trading partners are going to reduce our agricultural tariffs to one another, which of course allows for easier and freer trade in food. And then there's the section we call the rules part of the agreement. And that includes disciplines on making sure you have science-based measures on sanitary and phytosanitary rules, this, mitigating the impacts of trade, or making sure that we can protect animal and plant health and food safety, for example. That if we're all following the same set of rules about how we set that policy, then it's easier to trade. But there are some other aspects that I think we don't necessarily think of as promoting food security, but that are key in trade negotiations as well. And one is a general chapter on transparency, where when countries do adopt these new rules, that they notify them to the WTO, they notify trading partners, that they publish changes in regulation and how they intend to move forward. And of course, that's a huge opportunity then for producers to adapt to new market opportunities, to provide comment if they see that the way that new rules might be implemented could in fact have a detrimental impact on the ability for goods to move across borders. And so that applies not only to changes directly in trade policy, but also environmental and labor policy and other aspects that fall under the rubric of that trade agreement that of course can have a big impact on climate change. And on food security more generally. There are chapters, for example, on intellectual property protection and on trade and services, which I think are increasingly important for food security. If we look at developing new varieties using biotechnology, nanotechnology to address some of those underlying problems in virus resistance, salt tolerance, nutrition in foods, that sort of second generation of those products that can be useful. And then also, I think a key part when we talk about ag trade that we forget to talk about sometimes, and has really been brought up on this panel, is trade and agricultural services. Yeah. And there are companies that have developed real expertise on how to use resources better, how to get better growth out of livestock, how to deal with some of these areas of volatility in crop production. And that in itself is a good or a service that we should be exporting and sharing that knowledge and developing it well. So, I think easing the barriers to all those kinds of things are ways that trade agreements in their general structure contribute to food security. There's also work, I think, in the WTO context that could be done more to provide trade capacity building, education about international animal and plant health standards, for example, and how they can be broadly applied and adopted in countries where, frankly, it takes a lot of capacity to do risk assessments and to set those policies well. We could be doing more there.
Shenggen.
Yeah, very briefly, on WTO trade negotiation, you might remember last December in Barney, the ministerial level meeting, the two agreements. One is obviously the trade facility. Yeah. The other one is actually very much related to what we have discussed here, food security. So India proposed a so-called food security clause. And I think it's great that we put food security very high in any trade negotiation, but we have to be very careful that we do not use trade to protect certain inefficiency. For example, in the case of India, India government wants to to make sure that they will have the ability to purchase the food from farmers at the administered price, then redistribute the food to poor people through subsidies. I mean, you have to be very careful that the over subsidies, even in terms of distribution, has opportunity cost. Is there a better way to spend that money? For example, to increase its productivity through investment in research, in rural infrastructure, climate smart agriculture? Probably, yes, subsidy is very much needed, but the subsidy has to be targeted. Subsidy has to be efficient and make sure that it reaches to...
There's an assumption underlying this report, but also a lot of discussions around this subject, that we can have a second or third green revolution, whatever number it is, that the science is doable, as long as the will and the money is there. Does everybody agree with that?
Yeah. Yeah.
That we can develop crops that will withstand some of the extreme heat that's being forecast with the salination of water we're already experiencing, all the sort of climate-related weather patterns, that we can get science that will improve crop productivity in the teeth of these trends. Does everybody agree with that?
Most definitely.
You all agree with that? Sorry, James.
I also think that it's an opportunity for investment of a scale that should be attractive to all institutional investors, wherever they are in the world, including the increasingly large amounts of capital being accumulated in the emerging economies. So in my experience with this one particular investment in Tanzania, you can see real improvement in yields, not just from technology, but from new ways of doing business. So just to illustrate the needs to combine finance, technology, in this case very little public policy, but some engagement of public assistance, public aid money, and new ways of doing business. This is a 5,000 hectare rice farm in Tanzania, where we made an arrangement with the smallholders who are on the land to share space, to regularize their position on that land, to bring in, with the assistance, thank you very much, of USAID, eventually, a smallholder rice program to improve their yields. The smallholders have an option, not an obligation, to sell their rice through us, to have their rice milled in our mill or just dried, or they can sell it on the road outside in market prices. In the space of a single season, they had, in some instances, some of those farmers had doubled their yields and were making decisions like, I'm going to send my daughter to school now. Transformative in a very short period of time. That technology is not complex. But the next phase of development of that asset involves using the waste to create energy. It means that the entire valley now might have access to sustainable energy as a result of what is happening on our property. The infrastructure is still poor, but you can see quite clearly what happens when the first steps to improve productivity lead on to the next and the next. And that is an agricultural region now that has tremendous potential, into which you could bring a real breakthrough technological advancement that might have been pioneered in another country. And I remain resolutely optimistic that when you combine those things, finance, technology, and hopefully helpful public policy, we'll be dealing very well with this extremely challenging set of security issues.
Patrick, I wanted to ask you the same question.
Well, let me just put a little turn on it. You know, I have what every farmer wants. 2 children on the farm and 6 grandchildren. That's what you want, that hope for the future. But I will tell you, Family Farm Alliance wrote a paper on climate in 2007, and no ag groups are writing papers on climate in 2007. And it's still a little dicey as to what, you know, what the debate's going to be about. And it was the head of the HHS at the federal government, Tom Thompson, talked about laying awake at night and worrying about our food supply. And so our response was, it is a national security issue, so that was, you know, 7 years ago. But also, the answers are flexibility and adaptability. That's what farmers need. And what farmers are afraid of, and you want to know what they talk about in the coffee shop, is that the natural inclination of government is to assert control, not to give more flexibility and more adaptability. And you know, there's all the statistics that we can go back and forth on, but the one that's the driver that was mentioned earlier today is the average age of farmers. I shouldn't be the average age of farmers, maybe even above it.
Yeah, you're quite useful.
But the reality is, children and young people are looking at these debates and trying to decide, is this something I want to be in? And we have to be very clear about what these policies that we're anticipating are going to mean to them.
I do want to get into a question about language and how we talk about these issues in a minute, because I think people understanding them is the first step to change happening. Juergen, I wanted to ask you, in the absence of an internationally agreed system of carbon trading, in the absence, in other words, of a carbon price, what's the market going to come up with?
Well, at the end of the day, I think I mean, if you look in the energy business, for example, that is the most, I think the most recent demonstration. What you see is through shale gas, there is a very cheap U.S. coal available for European power plants, and so the Europeans actually now can only make money if they run their coal power plants as opposed to their gas power plants. And that is a more carbon-intensive way to produce power, and therefore the European emissions actually increase as opposed to decrease. And that can only happen because there is no penalty on the amount of emissions. So that is the way how markets respond, and therefore I think it's absolutely crucial that one has a price for carbon on a global basis to not allow those kind of effects.
I suppose my question is, can we get a price without there being an international agreement?
Yeah, well, we have one. We have a variety of prices, right? And you just we needn't depend upon a single multilateral, world-sorted-out agreement in order to get a value for carbon established in a variety of ways. You can see it right here in North America today. Mexico has a carbon tax, it has a tradable element attached to it to reduce the cost to, covers 80% of the economy. California has a carbon pricing mechanism. So Washington has just agreed to go the same way. British Columbia has one too, and so does Quebec, and they're all finding ways of connecting to each other. The European Union is just about to reset its carbon market sometime during the course of this year to make up for the fact that it has failed institutionally to keep a price at a meaningful level. And sure enough, whoever thinks it's a good idea to invest in coal is going to get a surprise, right? Because that price will come. Right? It's a short-term play, not a long-term play, in my view. But we haven't given up on valuing carbon globally. And even if we don't get some magic agreement in 2015, I'm quite optimistic about the climate agreement in 2015, I guarantee you many parts of the world, China being a very good example today, will establish their own tailor-made carbon valuation systems, and I hope they extend them to things like soil. I hope they make it attractive to farmers to pursue conservation strategies. I hope they make soil scientists and hydrologists as valuable as bankers. That would be a great breakthrough.
Oh, I obviously have a terrible sense of time. I thought we were about halfway through. I had some devastating questions. You'll just have to take my trust on that one, because I apparently don't have time to ask any of them. About 2 minutes ago, I was told there was 1 minute left. But I'd just like to thank all of you for a really interesting and very educational range of views, and hope to do this with you again sometime.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.